There is a particular kind of person that an avoidant encounters once, maybe twice in the full arc of their relational life. Not the person who loves them patiently, not the person who understands their psychology and makes accommodations for their patterns, and absorbs the withdrawals with a grace that the avoidant privately relies on without adequately acknowledging. Those people, as rare and as genuinely valuable as they are, still fit within the avoidant's existing framework. Their love, however generous, however perceptive, however consistently offered in the face of consistent inconsistency, is something the avoidant's relational architecture has a category for. The understanding partner, the patient one, the one whose love is large enough to contain the avoidant's limitations, without requiring those limitations to change. The avoidant knows, at some functional level, how to exist within that love, how to receive it at the level their defenses permit, how to return from the withdrawals it absorbs, and find it still there, still offered, still available. The architecture has a room for this person, a room with walls measured precisely to the dimensions of what the avoidant can tolerate receiving. And the patient, understanding, generous partner lives in that room, and the avoidant manages the relationship from the doorway, close enough to benefit from the warmth, far enough to never be fully inside it. Then there is the other kind of person, the kind that does not fit in any room the avoidance architecture contains, the kind whose love is not simply generous, but is perceptive in a way that is genuinely different from ordinary emotional intelligence, whose attunement to the truth of things, to what is real beneath what is performed, to what is felt beneath what is managed, to what the avoidant is actually doing beneath the story the avoidant tells about what they are doing, is not something the avoidance defenses were built to handle. Who sees, not partially, completely, with the specific, penetrating, entirely compassionate, and entirely unsparing clarity of someone whose emotional perception operates at a depth that the avoidance walls were never constructed to be opaque to. This person is the superempath, and what happens when an avoidant betrays them is not what the avoidant expected, not what their history prepared them for, not what the script has ever produced before. It is the end, and understanding why, understanding the specific, precise, psychologically complete reasons why betraying a superempath ends the avoidant in a way that no other relational experience can, is what this conversation is about. Before going further, the term superempath needs to be defined with some precision, because it is a term that gets used loosely and sometimes in ways that romanticize what is actually a specific and demanding set of psychological characteristics that carry significant costs alongside their gifts. A superempath is not simply a highly sensitive person, though sensitivity is part of it. It is not simply someone who feels deeply, though feeling deeply is foundational to it. It is not the person who intuits other people's emotions accurately, though that accuracy is one of its defining features. The superempath is someone whose emotional perception, relational attunement, and capacity for genuinely unusual, that allows them to perceive the interior reality of another person with an accuracy and a completeness that most people never achieve. Who can hold the full complexity of another human being, their light and their shadow, their genuine feeling and their defensive performance, their stated self and their actual self, without the cognitive distortions that most people bring to the project of understanding someone they love? This capacity is not always comfortable. It is not the effortless superpower that the romanticized version of the empath narrative presents. It is often the source of significant pain, because perceiving people accurately means perceiving their limitations clearly, which means loving people while fully seeing the ways their patterns will eventually cause damage, which means absorbing the damage with the specific, complicated grief of someone who knew it was coming and loved the person anyway. The superempath in a relationship with an avoidant has, in almost every case, known exactly what the dynamic was for longer than they allowed themselves to act on the knowing, has felt the withdrawals registering as something more than ordinary relational difficulty, as the specific pattern of a defended person whose capacity for sustained intimacy has a ceiling that the connection keeps pressing against, has understood, at some level of perception that operated below the hope and the love and the genuine investment in the relationship's potential, that the hurt was coming, not as a prediction, but as a reading. The way a skilled navigator reads the weather, not knowing exactly when or how, but knowing the conditions are present. And loving the avoidant anyway, choosing, consciously or in the deeper way of someone whose love is larger than their strategic intelligence, to stay in the connection despite the reading. Not from naivety, from a specific, generous, sometimes self-sacrificing quality of someone whose capacity for compassion extends to people who are not yet capable of meeting that compassion adequately. Who can see the wounded person inside the defended one and love them both? The wounded person who deserves the love, and the defended one whose patterns keep preventing the love from being properly received and returned. This is the person the avoidant betrayed, not a naive person who did not see it coming. A person who saw it coming and stayed because the love was genuine and the hope was real, and the understanding of the avoidance wounds produced a compassion that made leaving feel like abandoning someone in a kind of pain that was not their fault. That context is essential for understanding why the betrayal ends differently than it ends with anyone else. What does it mean specifically for an avoidant to betray a superempath? Because betrayal in this context is not necessarily the dramatic singular event that the word sometimes suggests. It can be that, but more often in avoidant dynamics, the betrayal is the cumulative one. The accumulation of withdrawals that were absorbed and forgiven without full accountability. Of promises, stated or implicit, that were made and then quietly unmade through the behavior that followed them. Of the specific, repeated, pattern-driven failure to show up in the ways that were asked for and that were within reach, but were consistently, deliberately, if unconsciously, chosen against. The betrayal is the moment, or the series of moments, or the final moment in a series of moments, when the avoidance behavior crosses from the understandable limitations of someone who is wounded and defended and struggling with patterns they did not choose, into something that requires a different accounting. The moment when the damage caused is no longer adequately contained within the framework of this is their pattern, and they are working on it, and the love is worth the difficulty. The moment when the gap between who the avoidant is capable of being and who they are consistently choosing to be becomes undeniable, not just to the superempath, who has known it for longer than they have been able to act on the knowing, but to the relationship's ability to continue in good faith. For a superempath, this moment is not a surprise. It is, in many ways, a relief. The terrible, grief-soaked, conflicted relief of someone who has been holding the knowing at a distance from the action for longer than was healthy, finally finding that the knowing has become loud enough that the action it was always pointing toward is no longer avoidable. The superempath does not end the relationship in anger, not in the hot reactive way of someone who has been unexpectedly betrayed and is responding from the immediate wound. They end it from the specific, quiet, devastatingly clear place of someone who has been gathering the evidence for a long time and has finally, honestly, allowed the evidence to be what it is, rather than what the hope needed it to be. And that quality of ending, that clear, complete, grieved but unshaken quality, is the first thing the avoidant encounters that their patterns have no adequate response to. The avoidant has ended relationships before, or has been in relationships that ended, and the endings, in most cases, followed patterns that their psychology was prepared for. Either the ending was something they initiated, a withdrawal that became permanent, a managed exit that preserved the sense of control, or it was something the other person initiated with enough distress and enough visible pain and enough emotional expression that the avoidant could locate in the messiness of the other person's reaction. Enough reason to feel that the ending was complex, that there was fault on both sides, that the grief they might feel about it was adequately contextualized within the story of a dynamic that was simply not workable, rather than within the story of their own specific failures. The superempath's ending does not provide these exits. It is too clear, too specific, too free of the dramatic expression that would give the avoidance defensive narrative something to work with. The superempath, in ending the relationship after the betrayal, does not perform their pain in ways that can be labeled excessive or destabilizing. They do not pursue or beg or create the scenes that would allow the avoidant to cast themselves as the one who was overwhelmed, rather than the one who caused the overwhelm. They do not provide the emotional chaos that the avoidant has historically used as evidence that the problem was the other person's inability to manage the dynamic, rather than the avoidance pattern of creating the conditions that made the dynamic unmanageable. They simply go, with the specific, quiet, irreversible quality of someone who has made a decision from a place of genuine clarity and does not require the avoidant's understanding or agreement or even acknowledgement of the decision in order to inhabit it fully. They go in a way that is too complete to be called a dramatic exit and too deliberate to be called a gradual withdrawal. They go in the way of someone who has arrived somewhere rather than someone who is leaving somewhere. As though the ending is not the loss of something, but the completion of a process that was always moving toward this point, and the super empath has simply finally allowed the process to arrive where it was going. This going, its quality, its completeness, its absolute absence of the ambivalence that most endings carry, is the first shock to the avoidance system, because it does not match any ending they have previously experienced or previously produced. It does not leave a gap through which the return could be managed. It does not provide the partially open door through which the avoidance usual strategy of gradual rewarming could operate. It is simply closed, gently, completely, with the specific finality of someone who does not close doors in anger, but who, once they have closed them, does not reopen them from a place of insufficient change. The second shock is the absence of the pursuing behavior that endings in avoidant dynamics have historically produced. Most people, in the aftermath of a relationship with an avoidant, pursue. It is the understandable, human, entirely predictable behavior of someone whose attachment system is activated by loss and who has spent the relationship reaching and continues from momentum and from genuine feeling to reach even after the formal ending. The pursuit confirms something for the avoidant that their psychology requires in the aftermath of loss, the confirmation that they were significant enough to be pursued. That the relationship's ending was not the quiet, uncomplicating departure of something that was not that important, but rather the painful, complicated, still reaching departure of something that mattered. The super-empath does not pursue, not from strategy, not from pride, from the specific, quiet, fully inhabited place of someone who is genuinely done, whose love for the avoidant was real and remains in some form real. Because genuine love does not simply vanish because the relationship it was invested in ends, but whose self-respect and whose clear-eyed assessment of what the dynamic was and what the betrayal confirmed have together produced a state that is not compatible with the pursuing behavior. The super-empath's non-pursuit is qualitatively different from ordinary non-pursuit. It does not have the strained quality of someone holding themselves back. It does not have the performance of someone making a deliberate choice not to reach. It has the organic, unforced quality of someone who has genuinely reached the end of the reaching, who is not monitoring their own impulse to pursue and managing it, who simply does not have the impulse in the form that pursuit requires, because the clarity of what happened and what it means has moved them to a place that is genuinely beyond the dynamic, rather than a place that is managing itself in relation to the dynamic. The avoidant encounters this non-pursuit with a disorientation that is, in its early stages, managed through the usual defensive reframings. They are playing games. They will reach eventually. This is a more sophisticated version of the silencer strategy that I have seen before. The defenses have answers for performed non-pursuit because performed non-pursuit is something they have encountered. They do not have answers for the genuine variety. And the genuine variety reveals itself, over time, in the specific quality of a silence that does not break on the timeline that performed silence breaks on. That does not carry the quality of waiting that performed silence always eventually reveals. That simply continues, not as a strategy with a duration, but as the natural expression of someone who has moved on. The third shock is the most significant and the most consequential for the avoidance long-term psychology, and it is the one that produces what the title of this conversation describes as the fall. The super-empath, in leaving, takes something with them that the avoidant did not know they had until its absence made it undeniable. They take the being known. Throughout the relationship, the super-empath's specific and unusual capacity for accurate perception meant that the avoidant was, within the connection, known in ways they had never previously been known. Not just the performing self that most people encounter and relate to. The actual self, the wounded, defended, genuinely feeling, specifically limited, capable of more than they are currently being self. The self that the walls were built to protect from exactly the kind of seeing that the super-empath brought to every interaction. The super-empath's seeing was not the seeing of analysis or diagnosis. It was the seeing of genuine witness. Of someone who perceived the full complexity of the avoidant, the fear beneath the distance, the love beneath the withdrawal, the longing for genuine connection beneath the patterns that kept genuine connection at a managed distance, and held that perception with love rather than with judgment. Who knew the avoidant in the specific, intimate way that only people of extraordinary emotional perception can know another person? Who saw through the performance without making the performer feel exposed in the threatening way that exposure usually feels? Who made being known feel, in the best moments of the relationship, like the safest possible experience rather than the most dangerous one? This was not ordinary. The avoidant may not have been able to articulate its extraordinariness while it was present, may not have had the language or the self-awareness to name what the superempath's perception gave them. But the nervous system knew. At the level below articulation, at the level where the body keeps its own account of relational experience, the nervous system knew that something was happening in this connection that had not happened in previous ones. That the specific quality of being seen and held by someone whose perception reached the real thing rather than the managed presentation was unlike anything the avoidant had previously experienced. When the superempath leaves, they take that quality with them. Not deliberately, not as a punishment, simply because it was theirs. It was their perception, their capacity, their specific and unusual gift, and they carry it with them wherever they go. And its absence in the avoidant's life after the ending is not the ordinary absence of a specific person. It is the absence of a quality of being known that the avoidant may never encounter again. Because the superempath's perception is not common. The specific combination of emotional depth, relational attunement, genuine compassion, and the particular form of clear seeing that the superempath brings to connection is not something that can be replaced by the next relationship or managed away by the next withdrawal, or recovered through the ordinary healing that ordinary endings require. This is the fall that the avoidant never expected. The specific, private, often not fully articulated experience of someone who has lost not just a relationship, but the only relational experience they have ever had of being genuinely, completely, safely known. And knowing that they lost it not to circumstance, but to their own pattern. To the specific, repeated, ultimately undeniable failure to show up for someone who saw them clearly and loved what they saw, and stayed long past the point where the seeing and the loving were being adequately honored. The fall is not the same as the ordinary grief of losing a relationship. It is qualitatively different and requires its own naming. The ordinary grief of loss is organized around the absence of the person, their specific qualities, the specific experience of being with them. It is real and significant, and eventually, with time and with the living of life in the direction of healing, it moves through its stages and arrives somewhere that is not quite the other side of the grief, but is a different relationship with it. A relationship in which the grief is present, but no longer the primary texture of every day. The fall is organized around something different, around the specific, recursive, often tormenting recognition that the thing that was lost, not by fate, or by incompatibility, or by the genuine neutral collision of two people whose lives were moving in different directions. It was lost by choice, by the repeated, patterned, finally accumulated choosing of the distance over the depth, of the management over the presence, of the comfort of the defended position over the risk of the open one. The fall includes the grief of the ordinary loss and adds to it the specific weight of a person confronting the direct relationship between their own patterns and the thing that is no longer there. This is not a comfortable confrontation. For most avoidants, it is the most uncomfortable confrontation available, more uncomfortable than the losses that can be attributed to external causes, more uncomfortable than the endings that can be framed as mutual or circumstantial, or simply the way things sometimes go, because this one cannot be framed as anything other than what it is. The superempath's clarity, even in leaving, even in the specific way they went, without drama, without the chaotic expression that could have provided cover for a defensive narrative, removed the available exits. The ending was too clean, the non-pursuit too complete, the silence too genuine to be contextualized into anything except the honest thing, which is that the avoidant had something rare, something that perceived them and loved what it perceived, and stayed in the face of patterns that should have ended the staying much earlier. Something that was not replaceable or reproducible or available around the next corner in the next relationship. And the patterns that the avoidant chose over and over, in the face of all of that, those patterns produced this: the cleanest, most complete, most irrevocable ending available in relational life. The ending of someone who sees clearly and who, once they have decided, does not look back from insufficient reasons. What does the fall look like in the avoidance life after the ending? In the days and weeks and months that follow the superempath's departure, in the specific texture of a life that has lost the quality of being known. It looks like a particular kind of flatness, a specific, difficult-to-name diminishment of the relational texture that the superempath's presence and their perception provided. The avoidant will engage with other people, will return to the ordinary rhythms of their social and professional life, will appear to most observers to have moved through the ending with the composure that avoidants characteristically bring to loss, will maintain the self-sufficient, emotionally managed, apparently unshaken exterior that their patterns provide. But in the specific, honest, private moments, in the interactions that brush against something that the super empath used to make available, in the conversations that reach for a depth that is not there, in the moments of genuine feeling that have nowhere adequate to go because the person who could have received them with the specific quality of reception they required is no longer present, the flatness is palpable. And it is specific. It is not the general flatness of someone who is sad. It is the targeted flatness of someone who is encountering, repeatedly and in specific ways, the absence of something that was particular rather than general. Something that cannot be replaced by more of what is ordinary because it was not ordinary. There is a specific and important question that the fall eventually forces the avoidant to confront, and it is the question that has the potential, not the guarantee, but the potential, to produce the genuine change that the fall was pointing toward all along. The question is not the general therapeutic one about attachment styles and relational patterns and the early experiences that produced the defended architecture. The avoidant has access to that question and has been able in most cases to engage with it at the intellectual level without it producing fundamental behavioral change. The intellectual understanding of why they are the way they are has been available to them. It has been, in many cases, one of the management strategies, the routing of the uncomfortable knowledge of their own limitations through the intellectualizing of it into something that can be contextualized without being changed. The question that the fall forces is different. It is specific and personal and about the particular thing that was lost, rather than the general pattern that produced the loss. It is, at its simplest and most devastating, did I just lose the only person who was ever going to know me like that? This question cannot be answered by intellectual understanding of attachment theory. It cannot be managed through the contextualizing of the pattern within the history that produced it. It is a question about the specific, irreplaceable, quantitatively unusual quality of what the superempath brought to the knowing of them, and whether that quality is something they will encounter again, and whether if they do encounter it again, they will be in any different position to honor it adequately. The honest answers to both parts of that question are uncomfortable. The superempath's specific quality of perception and love is not common. The probability of encountering it again, at the same depth and in the same configuration of genuine connection, is not high. This is not catastrophizing. It is the plain statistical reality of a quality that is genuinely unusual meeting a person who was genuinely right for it. And if the encounter did come again, if the specific fortune of meeting another person of that depth and that perception and that capacity for genuine compassionate knowing were to occur, the avoidance current architecture would produce the same outcome, the same management, the same ceiling, the same eventual betrayal in whatever form the pattern finds this time, of someone who deserved better and stayed longer than was healthy because the love was genuine and the hope was real, unless something changes, unless the fall does what it has the potential to do. Unless the specific, honest, can't be contextualized away grief of having lost the thing that the fall reveals as lost, the being known, the safe perception, the genuine witnessing, becomes the motivation for the architectural work that intellectual understanding never produced. The superempath, in all of this, is not a victim. This requires saying clearly, because the narrative of the superempath tends, in some tellings, to move in the direction of the martyred, excessively giving person whose gifts were exploited by someone incapable of honoring them. That narrative is not the honest one, and it does not serve the superempath's own healing or growth. The superempath chose to stay, for longer than was healthy in many cases. With a clarity about what the dynamic was producing that was available, and not acted on for longer than was fair to themselves. The staying was not entirely the product of the avoidance pull or the dynamic's gravity. It was also the product of the superempath's own patterns, the specific ways that their capacity for compassion and their attunement to the wounded person inside the defended one made leaving feel like abandonment rather than self-protection. The ways that their gift for holding complexity allowed them to hold the genuine love and the genuine damage simultaneously for longer than the damage warranted. The superempath's work, the work that their encounter with the avoidant was always also pointing toward, is the work of applying the same quality of perception and compassion to themselves that they brought so abundantly to the avoidant, of seeing themselves as clearly as they see others, of holding their own needs and their own worth with the same quality of witness that they extended to a person who was not yet capable of reciprocating it, of understanding that the capacity for deep compassion is only genuinely generous when it includes the self in its field of care. That loving someone else's wounded inner child while neglecting your own is not generosity. It is the specific self-abandonment that the super-empath's own patterns have been producing. And it is the work that the fall, their version of the fall, the grief of having given so much to a dynamic that could not honor it, was always pointing toward. The fall that the avoidant never expected is real. The ending of the avoidant, in the specific sense of the ending of the version of themselves that could betray someone who saw them and loved them and stayed, that ending is the most significant possibility that the fall opens. Not a certainty, a possibility, available to the avoidant who allows the fall to be what it is rather than what it can be managed into. The fall ends the avoidant who stays defended against it. Who manages the grief back to a comfortable level? Who contexts the loss within the narrative of incompatibility or mutual difficulty, rather than within the honest accounting of pattern and consequence? And the fall has the potential to end the avoidant in a different sense for the one who allows it to land. Who sits in the honest grief of it without the management? Who lets the question, did I just lose the only person who was ever going to know me like that, be as large and as serious as it actually is? Who uses the specific targeted architectural grief of the fall to finally reach the place where the intellectual understanding of the pattern connects to the felt, embodied, lived experience of its cost? For that avoidant, the one who falls honestly, the fall is not only an ending, it is the most painful and most important beginning available to them. The beginning of the version of themselves that the super-empath always saw and always loved. The version that was always there, beneath the defended architecture, waiting for something costly enough and true enough to make the dismantling feel not just possible, but necessary. The super-empath saw that version from the beginning, loved it while it was buried, stayed because the glimpses of it were real and the hope of its fuller emergence was genuine. And then finally, they stopped waiting for it to emerge on its own. They left. And in the leaving, in the specific, clear, irrevocable quality of the departure, they gave the avoidant the one thing that the staying never could. The honest truth of what the pattern costs. And with it, for the avoidant willing to receive it rather than defend against it, the first real possibility of something different. Not because the super-empath is gone, because what they represented, the being known, the safe perception, the specific quality of love that sees clearly and loves anyway, is now the measure against which everything else is measured, the standard that was established by the only person who ever reached the real thing. The avoidant will spend the rest of their relational life knowing what that standard feels like, knowing what it is to be truly seen, knowing that they had it and that their patterns produced the ending of it. And knowing, in the specific, personal, cannot be managed away way, that only genuine loss produces exactly what it will cost if they let the same patterns run in the face of the next person who approaches with that quality of genuine seeing, if they allow the knowing to be what it is. The fall is the invitation, painful, unexpected, produced by their own hand. The response to the invitation is still theirs to make. The invitation does not wait indefinitely. This is one of the things about the fall that distinguishes it from other forms of relational consequence, from the ordinary losses that avoidants have processed before, managed before, eventually contextualized into something sufficiently comfortable to move past without fundamental change. The ordinary loss has a long shelf life as a motivator. It can be returned to, considered, used as the eventual impetus for change, at whatever pace the avoidant's psychological comfort allows. The grief of it is real, but it is manageable. It can be set aside and returned to. It can be lived alongside without requiring immediate response. The fall has a different quality. It has urgency. Not the urgency of a deadline imposed from outside, not a pressure that arrives with explicit demands and explicit consequences for non-response. The urgency that is intrinsic to the specific kind of loss the fall represents. The urgency of someone who has finally, honestly encountered the full cost of their patterns in a form that is personal enough and specific enough and undeniable enough that the question it raises, am I going to change or am I going to keep producing this outcome, does not proceed back to the comfortable background of things to be addressed eventually. It stays in the foreground, not loudly, not with the acute crisis-level quality of an immediate emergency, with the persistent, low-level, always present quality of something that has moved into the primary residence of the avoidance awareness and is not going to vacate it until it receives an honest response. This persistence is the fall's most important feature, because the avoidance primary defense against genuine reckoning has always been time. The management of the uncomfortable feeling or the challenging question back to a level that is no longer urgent, no longer requiring immediate engagement, no longer loud enough to compete with the ordinary momentum of daily life. Most things, given enough time and enough routing through the management strategies, eventually quiet. The urgency diminishes. The question becomes less pressing. The motivation for genuine change, which was available in the acute phase of the loss, normalizes back to the background as the acute phase resolves. The fall does not normalize in the same way. The quality of what was lost, the being known, the specific and irreplaceable perception of the superempath, the experience of being genuinely witnessed by someone whose capacity for accurate seeing is extraordinary, does not fade with time in the way that the memory of ordinary relational qualities fades. It becomes, if anything, more clearly delineated as time passes and the contrast with the absence of it becomes more established. The avoidant encounters, in the ordinary relational interactions of their post-fall life, the specific and repeated evidence of what the superempath's presence made available, that ordinary relational interactions do not, and each encounter with the absence is a renewal of the fall's invitation, a fresh presentation of the question that the fall was always asking. What does the avoidant do with the invitation in the days and weeks immediately following the ending? In the period when the fall is newest and most acute and the management strategies are least effective against it, in most cases, the first response is not engagement with the invitation. It is the attempt to find a version of the ending that does not require the full weight of the honest accounting. The narrative search, the reaching for a framing that acknowledges the loss without arriving at the specific and most uncomfortable truth about its authorship. The narrative search has several stations. The first is the mutual difficulty station, the framing in which the relationship simply was not compatible, in which both people had patterns that made the dynamic unsustainable, in which the ending was the natural result of two people who, despite genuine feeling, could not find a workable configuration. This framing is comfortable because it distributes the responsibility broadly. It acknowledges that things went wrong without requiring the specific and targeted accountability of someone who betrayed someone, who saw them clearly and loved them generously, and deserved better. For some avoidance and some relationships, the mutual difficulty framing contains enough truth to hold, but the relationship with a superempath resists it. Because the superempath's clarity in the ending, the specific, unambiguous quality of their departure, does not support the mutual framing. It does not have the messiness that mutual difficulty produces. It has the clean, specific quality of someone who arrived at a clear conclusion about a clear situation. And that clarity, which is one of the superempath's most characteristic features, persists in the memory of the ending and keeps undermining the narrative attempts to distribute the responsibility more comfortably. The second station is the incompatibility station, the framing in which the superempath's specific qualities were simply not compatible with the avoidant's specific needs, in which the superempath's depth of perception and demand for genuine presence was too much for someone who requires more space and more distance and more emotional management than the superempath's love allowed. This framing is more sophisticated than the mutual difficulty framing because it uses something true, the genuine mismatch between the superempath's relational requirements and the avoidant's current capacity to arrive at a conclusion that removes accountability. As though the incompatibility was a neutral fact rather than a statement about the avoidant's patterns requiring the most generous and most perceptive person they have encountered to reduce their requirements to a level compatible with the avoidant's defended architecture. The superempath, in their absence, still resists this framing, because the superempath did reduce their requirements for longer than was healthy, more times than was fair, with a consistency that demonstrated unambiguously that the issue was not the superempath's unwillingness to accommodate. The issue was the avoidant's consistent choosing, in the face of generous accommodation, of the pattern over the possibility. Eventually, if the avoidant is honest, and the fall tends to produce honesty in ways that other losses do not, the narrative stations are all passed through and found insufficient. And what remains, when the narrative search has exhausted itself, is the honest place. The place the fall was always pointing toward. The place that is not comfortable, but is, for the first time in the avoidance experience of their own relational history, genuinely true. The honest place has a specific texture. It is worth describing in some detail because the avoidant who arrives there, possibly for the first time in their relational life, is arriving somewhere they have never been before, and the unfamiliarity of it requires some navigation. The honest place is where the avoidant holds simultaneously the full weight of what was lost, and the full clarity of how it was lost, and the full unmanaged knowledge of the relationship between the two. Where the being known, the specific, extraordinary, irreplaceable quality of the super-empath's perception, is acknowledged in its full value rather than in the managed-down version that makes the losing of it less acute. Where the pattern that produced the betrayal is held without the contextualizing that usually softens it into something more manageable. Where the choice that the pattern represents, the repeated choosing of the defended position over the open one, in the face of someone who is offering something genuinely extraordinary, is acknowledged as a choice rather than as the unavoidable output of a psychology over which the avoidant has no agency. This last part is the most important and the most difficult, because one of the most effective management strategies available to someone confronting their own damaging patterns is the deterministic framing, the positioning of the pattern as something that happens through them rather than something they do. The I cannot help how I am framing, the this is how I am wired framing. The my attachment style produces these behaviors as unavoidable outputs framing. This framing contains real truth. The avoidance patterns were not chosen in any meaningful sense of the word. They were formed by experiences that the avoidant did not choose, in developmental conditions they had no control over, through learning that was adaptive rather than voluntary. The patterns are real and they are deep and they do not yield to simple intention. The I will just be different framing is as naive as the deterministic framing in the other direction. But the honest place holds something more nuanced than either the deterministic or the voluntaristic framing. It holds the truth that the patterns are deeply conditioned and not simply overcome by decision. And the equally true truth that the avoidant is a person with agency who has made and continues to make choices about whether to engage with the work of changing the patterns or whether to allow the patterns to continue producing their characteristic outcomes. The truth that the psychology explains, and the choice remains, that the wound is real and the responsibility is also real, that both things are simultaneously true and neither cancels the other. The super-empath knew this. This is one of the most specific and most uncomfortable aspects of the fall, the knowledge that the person who was lost not only loved the avoidant, but understood them, understood the dynamic between the wound and the choice, understood that the patterns were not the full story of the avoidant's capacity, understood, with the specific clarity of their perception, that the avoidant was capable of more than the patterns were currently allowing, and was choosing, in whatever tortured and defended and fear-driven way, not to access that more. The super-empath loved the more, waited for the more, extended the compassion and the accommodation and the generous staying that was supposed to give the more space to emerge. And eventually had to acknowledge, in the clear, honest, fully seeing way that is their defining characteristic, that the more was not emerging at a pace compatible with what they could continue to offer without fundamental harm to themselves. The avoidant in the honest place eventually arrives at a question that is more personal and more specific than the general therapeutic question about patterns and attachment styles. It is the question that has the most potential to produce genuine change, because it is the question that is most directly connected to the specific thing that was lost. The question is, what would it have required of me to be worthy of what she or he or they was offering? Not worthy in the abstract self-worth sense, worthy in the specific, behavioral, relational sense. What would the daily practice of being in that relationship with that level of honesty and that quality of presence have actually looked like? What would I have had to be willing to do, regularly, in ordinary circumstances, that I was consistently choosing not to do? What was the actual cost of showing up adequately to someone who was showing up completely? This question is useful because it moves away from the abstract and into the concrete. Because the avoidance management of the pattern has often operated in the abstract, in the general acknowledgement that more openness is needed, that more presence is required, that the pattern has costs. These general acknowledgements do not produce behavioral change because they do not identify specific behaviors to change. They acknowledge the category without addressing the instance. The question of what it would have actually required names the instances. The specific moment when the withdrawal was chosen over the staying. The specific conversation when the honest acknowledgement was available and the deflection was chosen instead. The specific opportunity for repair that was offered and was managed rather than genuinely met. The specific repeated instance-by-instance pattern of choosing the defended position that, accumulated across the full length of the relationship, produced the betrayal that produced the ending that produced the fall. Seeing the pattern at the instance level rather than at the abstract general level where it is easier to acknowledge without changing, is the shift that genuine change requires. And the fall, with its specific, targeted grief about a specific and irreplaceable loss, creates the motivation to look at the instance level in a way that abstract acknowledgement never did. Here is what the work of genuine change looks like for the avoidant who takes the fall's invitation seriously. Not the performed work. Not the intellectually adequate engagement with the concepts of attachment theory that produces the right language without the right behavioral shift. The actual work. The unglamorous, daily, specifically demanding practice of interrupting the patterns at the instance level. It looks like noticing the impulse to withdraw before the withdrawal occurs and making a different choice. Not effortlessly, not without the discomfort that the different choice always involves. With the full awareness of the discomfort and the full presence of the fear that the withdrawal was always designed to manage, and the choosing anyway. Not because the fear is gone, but because the cost of following the fear has finally, personally, specifically been felt at a depth that makes the cost of not following it feel more manageable by comparison. It looks like making the repair before it is urgent, before the person who has been hurt has processed the hurt to the point of closing the door. While the door is still open, and the repair is still available, and the choosing of it requires only the overcoming of the discomfort, rather than the miracle of reversing a conclusion already reached. This is the specific behavioral change that the fall most directly points toward, the repair made in time, not the return after the superempath has gone, the staying in the first place, the not withdrawing from the very moment when the pattern says to withdraw. The being present in the specific, ordinary, unremarkable moment when presence costs something and the pattern says the cost is too high. It looks like receiving love without immediately routing the receiving through the fear of what it will require. Without the reflexive assessment of whether the intimacy being offered is at a manageable level, without the automatic calculation of how much to return in order to sustain the connection, without exceeding the comfort threshold, simply receiving it, letting it land. Allowing the experience of being genuinely cared for to be what it is, rather than what it will require. This is perhaps the most specific and most challenging behavioral change available to the avoidant, whose fall was produced by a superempath, because the superempath's love was offered at a depth and with a completeness that the avoidant's receiving capacity has never been fully adequate to. Learning to receive at that depth is the work that makes the next encounter with that quality of love survivable without the pattern reasserting. The superempath, in all of this, has moved on, not in the shallow, performed, I am fine way of someone who is managing the grief of the ending, in the genuine, forward-moving, life-continuing way of someone who loved completely and was hurt genuinely and allowed the grief to be what it was and is now, incrementally and honestly reorienting toward the life that the relationship's energy was preventing them from fully inhabiting. The superempath's healing is not primarily about the avoidant. This is important to name because the narrative about the superempath can too easily become a narrative organized around the avoidant's fall and its consequences, and whether the fall produces change. The superempath's story does not belong to the avoidant story in that way. The superempath's story belongs to the superempath, to the specific and valuable and irreplaceable person who brought extraordinary gifts to an extraordinary degree of love in a dynamic that was not adequately prepared to honor those gifts. The superempath's work in the aftermath of the ending is the same work that was pointed toward earlier, the application of their remarkable perception to themselves, the honest examination of the ways that their own patterns contributed to staying longer than was healthy. The compassionate but clear-eyed assessment of what their specific gifts and their specific wounds in combination produce in their relational choices. The recognition that the capacity for deep compassion, when it is not matched by an equivalent commitment to one's own needs and limits, becomes a form of self-abandonment that is neither generous nor sustainable. The superempath who does this work becomes something that was already extraordinary, and becomes more so. Becomes the version of themselves in which the perception is intact, and the compassion is intact, and the capacity for genuine seeing and genuine loving is fully present, and is offered to someone who has done enough of their own work to receive it properly. Not perfectly. Not without the ordinary human imperfection of a person still in the process of becoming, but adequately. With the genuine behavioral instance level daily practice quality of someone who understands what they are being offered and chooses, repeatedly and without the defended architecture of the avoidant pattern between the offering and the receiving, to honor it. That person exists, not as a fantasy or a future projection, as the natural destination of someone who has the superempath's quality of love to offer, and who has done the work of requiring as the minimum condition of offering it that it be received by someone capable of that receiving. The superempath finding that person, or that person finding the superempath, in whatever configuration, the living of genuine, forward-moving, self-owning life eventually produces is not the ending of the story that the fall wrote. It is the ending of the story the dynamic was always preventing, the story in which the superempath's specific and extraordinary gift of genuine seeing and genuine loving finds its correct home. Not the defended home that requires the gift to reduce itself to a manageable level, the open home that rises to meet it. The avoidant who takes the fall's invitation, who does the honest work, who arrives at the instance level, who learns to receive and to stay and to repair in time, may or may not ever encounter the superempath again. The door that was closed gently and completely by someone who does not reopen doors from insufficient change, is not available to the avoidant simply because the fall produced the work. The superempath's clarity does not reverse because the avoidant finally became what the relationship needed. The superempath has moved toward their own life and their own healing, and the version of love that they deserve. And the avoidant, however genuinely changed, cannot claim as a reward for the change the specific irreplaceable person whose loss produced it. This is one of the most difficult truths of the fall, that the work it motivates does not come with the restoration of what the work was motivated by. That becoming worthy of what the superempath offered does not mean the superempath returns to offer it, that the change, if it comes too late for this particular connection and this particular person. And that this too lateness is itself part of the honest cost of the pattern. One more specific instance in the instance level accounting of what the choosing of distance over depth produced. The avoidant who has genuinely fallen, who has allowed the fall to do its full work, who has moved through the narrative stations to the honest place, who has done the actual instance level behavioral work of becoming different, carries this too lateness with them, not as punishment. As the final fully metabolized knowledge of what the pattern cost, the permanent, experientially grounded, cannot be managed away knowledge of the specific weight of what is lost when extraordinary love is met with defended inadequacy. That knowledge is the fall's most lasting gift, the thing that, once genuinely felt, changes the cost calculation permanently. That makes the next moment of choosing the withdrawal over the staying carry a weight it never carried before. That makes the next repair made too late or not at all arrive with a specific personal, historically grounded understanding of what too late and not at all actually produce. The fall did not end the avoidant in the sense of finishing them. It ended the version of the avoidant who could betray someone who saw them clearly without the full, honest, life-altering weight of knowing what that betrayal costs. That version is gone. What remains is the person who knows, who carries the fall as a permanent reference point for what love at that depth is worth and what it requires in return. Whether they honor the knowing in the next moment and the next is still their choice. It always was. Now they know what the choosing costs. And that knowing, earned at the specific irreversible price of the superempath's departure, is the most honest and the most important thing the fall gave them. Whether it is enough to change everything depends entirely on what they do next. The invitation was always to that, to the next moment, the one right in front of them, where the pattern says to withdraw and the fall says the cost of that withdrawal has already been paid once, in full, by someone who deserved better. And the question is simply whether they are willing to pay it again.